Soldier Mage King, Chapter 3. Lancelot and Merlin, Part 1. If Gwen hadn't been ill, Merlin would never have been on this short pilgrimage with Morgana in the first place. Though maybe that was for the best. Merlin didn't like to think about Gwen in her current predicament. They'd been ambushed on their way to Morgana's father's grave. The bandits had killed their escort and taken both girls. When they were left alone in the tent, they'd hatched a plan to escape. Merlin was terrified to tell Morgana there was a very easy way for them to do it. She knew Morgana was her friend, but she had been hiding for so long she was beginning to wonder if she would ever willingly tell anyone about her magic. The plan had gone well at first, but they'd failed to take into account the crossbows one of the men still had on him. Merlin screamed as the bolt buried itself in her leg. She collapsed, and Morgana, still in her shift, turned back. Merlin struggled to her hands and knees. "Go! Merlin!" She tried to come back down the path, and Merlin shook her head. "Morgana, it's you they're after. Go now!" Merlin stifled another scream as she shifted her leg. Tears filled Morgana's eyes, but she turned on her heel and ran. Now Merlin, the bolt removed, though she could feel a piece of metal still in her calf, was on the back of a horse, dressed in Morgana's clothes. Kendrick, their captor, claimed that Hengast, the man he worked for, had never met Morgana, only heard a vague description. "Pale, raven hair, pretty. You'll do nicely," he said with a grin. Merlin had been allowed privacy to remove the bolt and bandage her injury, as well as change. She wouldn't be running on her wounded leg anytime soon, nor would she be using magic. Every time she tried, the piece of metal left in her leg burned white hot, forcing tears to her eyes. She would not be getting out of this alone. Finding Morgana was a relief to Arthur, but the fact that she was alone, that made his heart sink. Morgana's story of what had happened, a hastily planned escape and a crossbow bolt in Merlin's leg downing her, made him feel like the bottom dropped out of the world. "You have to send a rescue party, please," Morgana begged. "She gave her life for mine. I owe her my life." Morgana insisted when Uther dismissed her out of hand. Arthur could see tears building in Gaius's eyes. Merlin was his ward, his apprentice, his daughter in all but blood. Arthur had already resolved when Morgana turned to him. "Arthur, please. I know she's your friend too. You can't leave her to die. Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. Glancing at his father out of the corner of his eye, he knew in that moment that if he disagreed with his father's word here and now, he would be kept on too short of a leash to even try for a rescue. "My father's right. It's too much of a risk," Arthur said, keeping his face schooled into a cool indifference. Uther nodded, mollified. Morgana looked scandalized. A soft sob told him Gwen had burst into tears as well. Across the throne room, Leon raised an eyebrow at him. The older knight knew how Arthur felt about Merlin, though he'd done his best to keep it to himself. "You should be ashamed of yourself, all of you," Morgana shouted as Gwen ran to her, ushering her out of the throne room. "You're leaving an innocent girl to be tortured to death because she saved my life." The pronouncement rang around them like a death knell. Arthur cleared his throat. "Sir Leon and I had planned to go hunting," he said, and his father nodded, staring after Morgana. "We may be gone several days." Uther seemed to clue back into the fact that he was being spoken to. "Of course. When you return, you can speak to the steward about finding a new maidservant," Uther said, dismissing Arthur with a wave. Leon followed him out of the hall. "Pack lightly. We'll need to move quickly if we have any chance," Arthur said, and Leon grinned, finally understanding what was happening here. "I'll have the stable hands pick the 2 fastest horses," Leon said, taking off at a run. Arthur returned to his own rooms and dismissed the servant waiting there. He was about halfway through packing his bags when his door burst open and to an irate Morgana. "You are a sniveling coward, Arthur Pendragon," she accused. Arthur let the insult slide as he shoved a map into his pack. "After everything Merlin has done for you, you would leave her to those animals. God only knows what they've done to her already, just for helping me escape." Morgana snapped, and the thought made Arthur's stomach turn. "Morgana!" he shouted. She stopped, not used to him shouting. He held up a spare set of clothing he had been about to shove into his pack. "If you stopped for a moment, you would notice I am packing." "Yes, for some ridiculous hunt with Sir Leon. What could you possibly be hunting when your closest friend has been taken captive?" she demanded, though he suspected she wasn't really looking for an answer. "Wayward servants," he said clearly, and she opened her mouth to yell again before she processed his words. "Wayward—" "You're going after her," she said, sounding surprised. It made Arthur bristle a bit. "Of course I am. I couldn't disagree with my father in front of the court. He'd have never let me out of his sight. And then what chance would I have?" Arthur grouched, tossing his pack over his shoulder. "Arthur!" He paused at the door. "I'm sorry. You're a good man," she said, and he grinned slightly, though it felt forced. He met Leon at the stables, but he wasn't alone. Gaius was there holding a bag. Merlin's bag. Arthur paused. Would Gaius tell Uther where he was really going? He'd always been his father's man, where Leon was the closest thing Arthur had to a brother. The physician held out the bag to Arthur. "You may need this. Merlin will know what to do with it, but in case she has fever or anything else that may keep her from assisting in treating her injuries, this one is to be poured into the wound," he said, holding up a small brown bottle. "This one is to be drunk for pain, but not if she's riding on her own. It will likely induce sleep if she's not been getting enough," he said, holding up a green bottle. Arthur grinned as he took the bag. "We'll bring her home, Gaius," he promised as he mounted up. Gaius nodded. "I have every faith you will, sire." Lancelot and Merlin, Part 2. Since leaving Camelot, Lancelot's prospects had not improved much. Knowing now that his dreams of becoming a knight could never be, he had taken to selling his sword. It wasn't often a pleasant task, though fighting like this in a cage for the entertainment of others was hardly the worst way he'd made a living in the past year or so. He was careful not to show his surprise when he spotted Merlin sitting at the side of the warlord Hengast, dressed in finer clothes than he'd ever seen her in. The gown was a deep emerald green, adorned at the collar with what looked to be those same gemstones. She'd put her hair up into a practical but intricate braid. If he hadn't known her from her crystal blue eyes, he would have sworn up and down that she was a lady of the court. "It seems your fighting has impressed our royal guest, Lady Morgana." Hengast introduced them, and Lancelot bowed. He had no idea why the subterfuge was happening, but he would not reveal her. "My lady," he said, and she nodded. Hengast waved his hand at the cage. "Next time you fight here, do not expect such mercy," he said with a cruel smile. "Release the Wildren." Watching the man he'd spared devoured was unpleasant. Merlin looked nearly as green as the dress she wore. Hengast laughed. "Show the Lady Morgana back to her chambers." He laughed, and two of his guards helped Merlin out of her seat. She pulled a face, but it was clear that she was wounded, limping. Lancelot frowned. Once the dinner was finished, he slipped away, down to the hall outside the dungeons. Hers was the only occupied cell. "Merlin," he called, and she jumped, looking up at the window he was crouched by. She grinned, wincing, scrambling to the window. "What are you doing here? And why does Hengast think you're the Lady Morgana?" he asked quickly, unsure how much time they had. "Because he very nearly had Lady Morgana. Gwen was ill, nothing serious, but she couldn't ride, so I went to keep her company instead. We were traveling out to her father's grave and we were ambushed. I managed to help Morgana get away," Merlin explained, and Lancelot raised an eyebrow. "You can't just unlock the door your way?" he asked. Merlin glanced around as though someone would have materialized in her cell while they were speaking. "I've got the tip of a crossbow bolt stuck in my leg. It's cold-forged iron. Gods know why these bastards had that, but I can't use any magic without hurting myself until I can get it out," she explained. She froze. "Someone's coming. I'll find a way to get you out of here. I swear it," Lancelot promised, and Merlin smiled at him. Leon had been mostly silent on the way to Hengast's fortress. They'd cut through the caves of Andor, barely avoiding the wildren within. As they made their approach, Leon frowned. "Sire, have you thought about what you're going to do if the worst proves true?" he asked quietly. Arthur shook his head. "It's not going to, so I don't see why that matters," Arthur said, snapping at his knight as quietly as possible. "But, sire, she has to be alive, Leon. I don't know what I would do without her. I know nothing can ever happen between us. I am aware that someday she will find someone without the weight of a kingdom on his shoulders, and I will lose her forever, but I cannot lose her now. I won't," Arthur said with finality. Leon shut up after that. They scaled the wall and killed 2 of Hengast's men, donning their clothes. Arthur pulled a cloth over his face, and they followed the sounds of cheers and jeering into a large room. The centerpiece here was a cage. It was near twice as tall as Arthur, but did not reach the ceiling. Through a gap in the crowd, Arthur spotted a head of raven hair held up in a messy braid, standing out starkly against the emerald green of the gown Morgana had lost. She was tied to someone, but the gate at the other end of the cage was opened, and Arthur's heart nearly stopped. A wildren emerged from the tunnel beyond, and Merlin screamed. Arthur yanked his sword and snatched another from one of Hengast's men, and was over the side of the cage before he could really process what he'd done. He recognized the man Merlin was tied to as he cut them loose from each other. "Lancelot!" he called, tossing him the second sword as Leon made it over the cage. Arthur shoved Merlin behind him as the wildren snarled. A massive crash sounded as the chandelier fell behind them, and Hengast cried out in pain. "The tunnel! It's our only shot!" Arthur called, and Leon nodded, keeping the creature back as he dove for the tunnel. Lancelot seized Merlin around the shoulders, taking the majority of her weight as Hengast rose and stormed to the cage, his own sword drawn. Knowing they were right behind him, Arthur made a break for it. Lancelot and Merlin were the last into the tunnel. The gate that had held the wildren down here slammed shut behind them, and Hengast screamed. Arthur stowed his sword and took Merlin from Lancelot as he and Leon remained on guard. Merlin was shaking, but he couldn't tell if it was from pain or fear as they ran. All that mattered right now was that she was alive. Gaius's bag of medicine also included a water skin full of wine. They discovered when Merlin boiled some of it to clean a long pair of tweezers and handed them to Lancelot. His hands were remarkably steady as he handed her a glove, and she bit down on it to keep herself as quiet as possible as he pulled a piece of metal out of her leg. She spit out the glove and instructed him to pour some of the boiling wine in the wound to clean it out, since Hengast's men had done little more than bandage it. That time, she did scream, and Arthur caught her before she could hit the forest floor as she fainted dead away. They finished treating her leg, and Arthur let himself sigh in relief. Lancelot left before morning, smiling to Arthur and asking him to pass on a token to Gwen, a small necklace Arthur didn't ask how he'd acquired. The last thing he said before he vanished in the trees was, "Keep an eye on her, Arthur." He nodded. Of course he'd keep an eye on Merlin. Their return to Camelot was a blur, Merlin only conscious for half of it. He let Leon take Merlin to Gaius when they arrived. Uther rolled his eyes and spent half an hour yelling at Arthur about risking his life, but Morgana beamed when she heard Merlin was back and alive. Arthur went to the physician's chambers later to check on Merlin and smiled to himself as he heard her speaking. "Sorry about your dress," Merlin said sheepishly as Arthur opened the door, he spotted her small smile as Morgana wrapped her in a hug. "Don't you think on it for even a moment. You saved my life." "Thank you. I am so glad you're all right. I have half a mind to steal you from Arthur," she said as she pulled back. "Hey," Arthur said, making her jump and grin only slightly guiltily. "I'm just saying you don't deserve her, Arthur," Morgana pointed out haughtily. Merlin laughed, and Arthur rolled his eyes, feeling for the first time in days that everything would be all right.